Mediation Analysis, its theory, issues and suggestion. In this session we are going to focus on the concept of mediation analysis, the issues and some strong suggestions on how to perform mediation analysis. Now, indirect or mediated effects constitute a type of relationship between constructs that often occurs in social sciences research. However, although the methods for mediation have become more sophisticated, researchers still continue to use outdated methods, which can lead to wrong results. Now, researchers focus on currently majority of the research are only focusing on direct relationships, simple relationships between independent and dependent variable. This can heavily bias the interpretation of results, when a variable has no direct effect, but its effect is mediated by another variable. And this is the reason that mediation models have become almost mandatory in contemporary literature and research endeavors. Now, if you want to publish, you may not be able to publish if you are just simply testing an independent variable and how it affects the dependent variable. Rather than journals are looking for complex models on how a variable affects the dependent variable. They are more interested in mediation. Now, before going into detail, let's understand the concept of mediation. To understand the relevance of testing mediating effects, it is necessary to understand what mediating effects are. The core of mediation analysis is that it assumes a sequence of relationship in which an antecedent or your independent variable affects a mediating variable, which then affects the dependent variable. So there is a sequence of relationship. X influences Y, Y influences Z. So your Y is your mediating variable. And what it does is, mediation is one way that a researcher can explain the process or a mechanism by which one variable affects another. So what mediation does is, it helps explain how one variable affects another variable. For instance, let's say we are focusing on servant leadership and life satisfaction. And we know that servant leadership, if there is highest level of servant leadership within the organization that is focused on the followers, this will lead to improved life satisfaction. But this relationship is not that simple, and neither it is so direct. What happens is, when there is servant leadership, when the leadership is focused on the followers, it helps achieve an increased amount of career satisfaction in the followers. That actually leads to improved life satisfaction. So here, career satisfaction as a mediator is helping us explain or understand the mechanism of impact through which servant leadership improves life satisfaction. So career satisfaction is our mediator. Now, before going in for mediation analysis or before actually conducting your research using mediators, you should do some preparation for mediation analysis. Using multiple mediators to make a model complex and introducing a mediator to see how it works, it is neither a good advice nor practice. Focusing solely on statistical issues or data analysis, like using advanced tools for statistical analysis of mediation or mediators, this is obviously not justified, or this would not justify a mediation study. So what you need to do is that you need to understand the significance of mediation. And the significance of mediation model mainly depends on the design decisions that one should take or one should consider before any analysis and even before the research is conducted. Now, you cannot just simply state the what aspect of contribution, that this M or mediating variable may mediate or will mediate the relationship between X and Y. You need to add another aspect to your model. The need of a mediator in the model must be explicitly raised and justified upfront by responding to two key questions. It's not just the what that matters, it's the why that matters. Why is this mediator needed? Why do you need to study this mediator? What will it do to existing research? What is the contribution of this mediator between the relationship? Which variable should be considered as the mediator and why? Again, why? Why should this be a mediator? How does this variable explains the relationship between the IV and DV? And this is your actual contribution to the theory. The conceptualization of a mediation relationship needs forethought. about the relationship between the variables of interest and the theoretical meaning. Why this variable needs to be included? What's the theoretical aspect of including this variable as a mediator? Why does this help explain the relationship? And why is this important for the theory? And once you answer this question of why, you are actually contributing to existing research. And among other issues, obviously there are that you need a proper instrument to measure all your construct, and most importantly, the sample size must be adequate to study mediation. Now there are different effects that we study when we are doing mediation. There is this effect, the total effect. Total effect refers to the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable without the presence of mediating variable, and it is represented by C, which is figure 1a, this one. Your independent variable affecting the dependent variable, and this path here is represented by C without any mediator present. However, when we include the mediator within the equation, the path from independent variable to mediator is referred to as A, the path from mediator to dependent is referred to as B, and the path from independent to dependent, which was previously C, is now changed to C complement. So your direct effect, it refers to the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable in the presence of the mediating variable, and now it is C complement. And your indirect effect, which is the effect of IV on DV through your mediator variable M. So these are three effects that one should know when one is conducting mediation. Now, how many hypotheses one should propose when testing mediation? Now, there are two approaches that one can use. One is segmentation approach and other is transmittal approach. In segmentation approach, you can propose three hypotheses. The effect of X on M, that is your path A, the effect of M on Y, that is your path B, and then your indirect effect. You see, there is no direct effect. There is no hypothesis on the path C or C complement, and we'll be discussing that later as well. It's not that you cannot propose the hypothesis, but we'll be looking at that in coming slides. So there is your mediation hypothesis or mediation effect. M mediates the relationship between X and Y, or X has an indirect effect on Y through M. And then there is transmittal approach, in which we neglect the first and second hypothesis and we are just proposing our mediation effect or mediation hypothesis. Now, we have been using one approach to test mediation, and that is Barron and Kenny's procedure. However, in modern research, there are advanced tools to test mediation, and a number of issues have been highlighted by existing scholars on why we should not use Barron and Kenny approach any further. The core characteristic of a mediating effect, that is indirect effect of mediation, is that it involves a third variable that plays an intermediate role in the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Now, technically speaking, the effect of independent variable, which is X, on the dependent variable, which is Y, is mediated by a third variable, which is referred to as M, and we saw this in our figure in the previous slides, where the figure 1 was the total effect of X on Y, represented by C, and figure B was the effect of X on Y through M, and the indirect effect is calculated using A into B, multiplying path A by path B. Thus, we formulate a mediation hypothesis. We focus on an independent variable affecting the dependent variable through the mediating variable. This is your Barron and Kenny approach. Now, scholars have followed a procedure similar to that proposed by Barron and Kenny for multiple regression analysis. How does Barron and Kenny approach work? Now, Preacher and Hayes have summarized this approach as follows. So, in order to have a mediating effect, in order to say yes, variable M has a mediating effect, variable M has an indirect effect between IV and DV, what you need to do is you need to be sure that yes, X has a significant impact on Y. So, this is the condition that needs to be settled or accepted. The other condition, if X has a significant impact on Y, M significantly accounts for variability in Y, that is your path B, this is your path A, and this is your path C. And the effect of X on Y with the presence of M in the model, it decreases. So your path C complement is lower than your total effect C. Now, mediation only occurs if all these conditions are justified. And here is the problem. In recent years, Barron and Kenny's causal step approach for determining mediation or mediating effects has been challenged considerably. For example, Barron and Kenny argue that X needs to show a significant impact on Y, that is your path C must be significant before you go on to other steps. Now, initially it seems unnecessary to further investigate whether there is a mediating effect or mediated effect if there is no C. So if your C is insignificant, you do not need to check for path A or path B. However, this argument will only hold true when you are doing complementary mediation. And what is complementary mediation? The case in which your path C has the same effect or direction as that of your indirect path A and B. So your path C is positive or negative, and your indirect path has the same direction, either positive or negative. However, if there is competitive mediation, for example, your indirect path is positive, that is A and B is positive, and your path C is negative, you do not, or this condition actually do not hold. So in any case, you should go further with other steps as well. In complex SCMs, this can become critical because different types of mediation can occur in the same model at once. You can have multiple mediators, and with those multiple mediators, there could be multiple direction of relationships. In such a case, it is possible that the direct effect, which is C, is not significant even if the mediation exists and is therefore misleading as a precondition to mediation analysis. So modern approaches actually tell us that you should go for further mediation analysis even if your impact of IV on DV is insignificant. Now moving on. Based on those shortcomings and a growing array of alternative approaches, the state-of-art guidelines have to consider following points for testing mediating effects in PLS. So our slides are more or less, or our session is more or less focused on PLS. First, testing the indirect effect. Rather than testing the direct effect of IV on DV, in PLS we test the indirect effect, A and B, and we test for significance of the indirect effect. Second, the strength of indirect effect. A and B should determine the size of mediation. So how strong is the indirect effect? This is the second step. And third, a bootstrap test should be used to test the significance of indirect effect. So these are the three alternative approaches in modern research. Now, testing the relationship between the antecedent X and the outcome Y. Now, testing the relationship between X and Y for mediation analysis is the first condition of Barron and Kenny causal step approach. Historically, because of such a condition and the step, several mediating relationships were rejected. Now, since previously people have been using the impact of IV on DV as the first precondition for mediation, although this should not have been the precondition, a number of relationships have been rejected or the study prematurely ended. A mediation analysis does not require an association between X and Y. To illustrate the relationship between X and Y needs to be considered when determining whether M mediates the effect of X on Y, because the path is not part of the mediated effect. Testing the significance of X and Y before or after examining a mediation effect is outdated and unnecessarily restrictive. Again, do not focus on relationship between X and Y as a precondition. If theory suggests the presence of mediation, researchers should test it regardless of the significance of relationship between X and Y. So you need to conduct the relationship between X and Y as a precondition. But if you want to test the relationship and propose a hypothesis between the relationship of an X and Y, obviously you can do that. That's not a problem. This means, or this does not mean that the researcher should stop testing the direct relationship. Again, if a theory suggests, you should go for it, but do not use it as a precondition for your mediation results. Advanced procedure for mediation analysis in PLS. Now in PLS, what we have referred to as, we first test the indirect effect. And what is your indirect effect? It is the multiplication of path A with path B. And in formula, we can express it as the difference between total effect and your direct effect. And we refer to this in our figure 1. So your indirect effect is total effect, that is C without the mediator, minus direct effect C complement in presence of mediator. So your direct effect is impact of IV on dV in presence of the mediator, depicted by a C complement or denoted by a C complement. Now mediation analysis in PLS. Now here are the steps that we can take, and we'll be looking at this in detail. Here is the decision tree. Now you need to first assess the significance of indirect effect. Rather than going for the impact of IV on dV, what we do is with PLS, we look into the significance of indirect effect. Now, if this effect is significant, the indirect effect is significant, you go for assessing the effect or the direct effect, C complement. Now, if the direct effect is insignificant, that is, there is no impact of IV on dV in presence of the mediator, this is full mediation. But what if the direct effect is significant? This is partial mediation. And now you need to assess the sign of A into B into C. And if the sign is positive, you go for complementary mediation. And if the sign is negative, you go for competitive mediation. Otherwise, if the indirect effect is not significant, then assess the significance of the direct effect, that is C complement. The direct effect is significant, there is no mediation, or the effect is direct only. The direct effect is significant, obviously there is no mediation but direct effect. But if the direct effect is insignificant, there is no effect, there is no mediation. So this is how you can use PLS for understanding the mediation process, and you start with testing the indirect effect. Now, what are the steps in detail? You first understand the significance of indirect effect, and in the first step you look into the indirect effect is tested for significance. Obviously PLS results give you the specific indirect effects that you can just go on and see the p-value and see if the specific indirect effects are significant. And you do not apply the Sobel test. The reason being that Sobel test assumes normality, but in case of PLS you cannot test or assume the normality for the indirect path. Alternatively, researchers should apply bootstrap routines to test the significance of the indirect effect A into B. The bootstrapping procedure is a non-parametric inferential technique that randomly draws several subsamples based on your sample with replacement from the original data set. Now, bootstrapping a data sample of an indirect effect is necessary to obtain information about the population distribution, or you cannot test the significance if you do not do bootstrapping. And normally the recommended size is 5,000 subsamples. Now step 2, determine the type of effect and or mediation that we earlier discussed. Now this involves defining the type of effect or the mediation. A mediation or mediating effect always exists when the indirect effect is A or B, A into B in step 1 is significant. So there will always be a mediating effect if your indirect path is significant. However, the current mediation literature discusses two types of mediation, full or partial mediation. Now partial mediation occurs, or partial mediation can be divided again into two approaches, complementary and competitive. Now what is full mediation? A full mediation is indicated in the case where their direct effect, that is the effect of IV on dV in presence of mediator, it actually becomes insignificant. And now we are saying that the total effect of IV on dV is passing through the mediator, and this is full mediation. Now it also means that Y or condition Y completely absorbs the positive or negative effect of X. In this way, it can completely pass the effect through the mediating variable, which is the other variable in our study. It is important to consider the sample size in mediation. The smaller the sample, the more likely the mediation when present is to be labeled full as opposed to partial mediation. Now you need to have adequate sample size when doing mediation analysis. Now partial mediation. When you have got an indirect effect or your effect A into B is significant and your direct effect is also significant. This is referred to as partial mediation. And there are two types of mediation or partial mediation. Complementary partial mediation. In a complementary partial mediation, the direct effect C and the indirect effect A into B point in the same positive or negative direction. So your C will be positive and your A into B will be positive, or your C will be negative and your A into B will be negative. This is complementary partial mediation. However, or it is called positive confounding or consistent model. However, there could be competitive partial mediation in which the direct effect might be negative and your indirect effect might be positive. Obviously, PLS gives you these results in the form of beta coefficient, and you can see the sign with the beta coefficient to understand whether it is competitive or complementary partial mediation. Moving on, previous researchers only focused on complementary mediation. In the competitive partial mediation hypothesis, it is assumed that the intermediate variable will reduce the magnitude of relationship between the independent and dependent variable. However, it is possible that the intermediate variable could increase the magnitude of the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. It's not just that with the inclusion of variable or with the inclusion of mediating variable, the impact of IV on DV gets reduced. There are times when the impact of IV on DV in presence of the mediator actually increases. And competitive partial mediation often have been called negative confounding or inconsistent model. Now, only the direct effect. If the indirect effect A into B is not significant, that is, your indirect effect is not significant, whereas the direct path, that is C, in the mediator or the mediator variable has no effect, this indicates that the direct non-mediating effect is present. So your specific indirect effect is insignificant, but your direct effect C is significant. So your mediator has no impact, and this indicates that a direct non-mediating effect is present. In this case, the study was perhaps searching for wrong mediation relationship. You should not stop here, and you should look for other variables that could mediate the relationship between an IV and DV. However, it is possible that an unrecognized mediation relationship still exists, and another mediation variable is present that mediates the relationship between X and Y. Thus, a researcher should rethink the model on theoretical basis, and if the expected mediation relationship cannot be found, so you look for other variables that could mediate the relationship between IV and DV in case your specific indirect effect is insignificant. No effect. So there is no effect if neither the indirect effect, that is A into B, nor the direct effect is significant. So both the relationships are insignificant. The specific indirect effect is insignificant and the direct effect is insignificant. So there is no effect. The total effect can still be significant. First of all, in this case, the researcher should determine whether the sample size has enough power to show the effect. Now, you should not just jump to conclusion. You should look for your sample size as well. Now, putting the last cases together, or the last two cases together, the indirect effect A into B is not significant and the direct path C is or is not frequently indicates a problematic or flawed theoretical framework. So if your indirect effect or your mediating effect is not significant, this means that you need to go back on the drawing board and look for other variables that could mediate the relationship. In this case, the researcher should thoroughly examine the hypothesized model and go back to the drawing board and look for other variables that could help explain the relationships. Now, contemporary literature on mediation advocates that complete, also called full, and partial mediation concepts have little value and should be abandoned. We should not use the terms complete and full mediation in our analysis. Now, what's the reason for this? Full mediation implies that a researcher has completely explained the process by which X influences Y, and no additional research is needed to search for further mediators. Obviously, there could be maybe tens of other mediators that could obviously explain the impact of IV on DV. So you cannot just say that, okay, this is complete or full mediation. The reality is that to claim full mediation, one would have to confidently measure all possible mediators and suppressors without error, and obviously this is not possible. So we should not complain or claim full or complete mediation. Moreover, scholars have recently advocated that claiming a complete mediation would likely to discourage other researchers from identifying other theoretically driven mediators. Researchers should avoid using these terms. Now, there are some additional aspects for assessing mediation model fits and strength in PLS. And for this, what we do is, it is emphasized that a good fit is required before interpreting mediation analysis in a structural model in context of CB-SEM. So when we are doing covariance-based structural equation modeling, there are techniques or there are fit indices that you can use to assess model fit, which is in line with general suggestions by Hensler and others in 2016 for PLS, that it should also become customary for PLS to determine the model fit. So when there is a model fit in CB-SEM, we should do it for PLS-SEM as well. Now, according to Wood, many authors inferred full mediation when a model excluding the direct effect, that is C complement, exhibited a better fit than a model including both direct and indirect effect. So, according to Wood, the authors have inferred that full mediation, or they say that full mediation occurs when a model without the inclusion of direct effect, it exhibits a better fit than a model that includes the direct effect and the indirect effects. In the past, there was no valid criteria for evaluating global fit for PLS, but in current PLS based software like Smart PLS, we've got SRMR. So the value must be, for SRMR, the value must be less than 0.08. And this shows that there is a sufficient fit. And what is variance accounted for? This shows the strength of the mediation when you are doing partial mediation. Mediation analysis regularly involves partial mediation, and therefore it can be helpful to have further information on mediated portion. So what's the strength of mediated effect? Strength of indirect relationship. One approach for this is calculating the ratio of indirect to total effect. This ratio is called as VAF value, variance accounted for. VAF determines the extent to which the mediation process explains the dependent variable variance. For simple mediation, the proportion of mediation is defined as this. So when you've got a simple mediation, this is how you can calculate VAF. Using VAF as a classification for mediation portion is not uncritical. Obviously, there has been critique on usage of variance accounted for. If the indirect effect is significant but does not mediate much of the total effect, although your indirect effect is significant, but it does not mediate much of the effect, the direct effect is still high and significant, VAF would be low. And a significant indirect effect and a insignificant effect C would indicate full mediation. Now, such differences between significance testing and VAF interpretation especially occur when the sample size is small. Again, you need an adequate sample size. A researcher should be aware that detecting a significant indirect effect is always higher than detecting a direct effect. Now, the rule of thumb that if the VAF value is less than 20%, one should conclude that nearly zero mediation occur. If its value is between 20% to 80%, it could be characterized as partial mediation, and if it's higher than 80%, it can be characterized as full mediation. Additionally, the interpretation of VF is clearly only for consistent and complementary mediating effects. So it's not for contradictory mediating effects. In one case, VF can be greater than 1 when the total effect C is smaller than the indirect effect. So with the inclusion of mediator, when the indirect effect increases, and it so increases than the total effect, its value can be greater than 1. In this situation, it's a suggestion that VAF equal to 1 should be considered as full mediation. Now what do you do when you have got multiple mediation or multiple mediating variables? Now PLS is regularly characterized by complex models. So there could be multiple mediators in your study, more than 1, 2, 3 or 4, 5 mediators. For instance, a complementary mediation variable M1 may mitigate the independent variable X to dependent variable Y, and at the same time you can have a competitive mediation as well. And from a naive perspective, someone can assume that independent variable is not relevant because there is no relevant total effect C. So your independent variable is actually not relevant. However, when one of the mediator variable has a strong influence on us in a certain situation, the independent variable also wins in terms of relevance. So this is your multiple mediation variable model, and this is your now what is the total effect? The total effect is A into B plus A2 into B2 plus C complement. So this is your total effect. This is the sum of specific indirect effect and the C value. This is your total effect. Thus, the total effect is the sum of direct effect, this, and the complete indirect effect, the sum of specific indirect effects, A1 into B1 plus AE2 into B2. That will assume, or that will give you the total effect. See this. This is how you calculate the total effect in case of multiple mediators. An interesting situation occurs when A into B and A1 into B1 and A2 into B2 in equation have opposite sign. This indicates that one effect functions as complementary and the other effect functions as competitive mediation. Such model is called an inconsistent mediation model. Consequently, even though significant specific indirect effect exists, the complete indirect effect may not be significant. This is important to know. Your complete indirect effect may not be significant, but your specific indirect effects may be significant. Now these are the few references that you can look into when studying mediation and that have been used for this particular tutorial. I know the video was very detailed, but if you look into this video, this would have helped you understand the concept of mediation in greater detail. Thank you very much.